All right, praising God for the way in which, once again, he understands how to get our attention. Let's look at Jonah chapter 4, in which he makes it clear that beyond being able to get Jonah's attention enough to simply get his compliance or his obedience, in chapter 4, he seems to get his attention enough to counsel his understanding of why God has gone through the process of dragging him to Nineveh to forgive a group of people who don't seem like they are going to eventually be very compassionate to Jonah and the people of Israel. Understanding that, chapter 4 is going to start in verse 1 saying, "But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry, and he prayed to the Lord and said, 'O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster.'" After all the buttering up, Jonah's going to say something that's actually pretty disturbing, as we have mentioned before. In verse 3, he's going to say, "Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live." So he's going to go on in verse 4 to have God, instead of granting this request, as he granted his request for a favor, as we termed it in chapter 2, from the belly of the fish, this time instead he's going to respond with a couple of questions, at least two that are going to start in verse 4, where he will ask Jonah, "Do you do well to be angry?" Jonah is going to respond by not answering, kind of like he did initially, not giving God a direct no or verbal answer, but still through his reaction, making it clear that he's not really happy with what God is asking him to do in chapter 1 or what God is asking him right now. So verse 5 is going to say, "He went out of the city, sat to the east of the city, and made a booth for himself there, and sat under it in the shade till he should see what would happen to the city of Nineveh." Now, God, being merciful again, in verse 6 is going to appoint a plant. It's going to give Jonah at least some what seems to be some additional shade. However, it's not all good, because Jonah is going to appreciate the plant seemingly and be exceedingly glad, in contrast to his exceedingly angry or his exceeding displeasure at the beginning of the chapter. But it's not going to last, because when dawn comes up the next day in verse 7, God is going to appoint a worm that is actually going to disease the plant or attack the plant to the point where it is going to wither. And if that's not bad enough, in verse 8, he is going to appoint a scorching wind to beat down on Jonah, at which point Jonah again is going to ask that he might die, stating it is better for me to die than to live. Verse 9 is going to go on for God to ask him again, this time a different version of the same question, this time specifically with regard to the plant. "Do you do well to be angry for the plant?" At which point Jonah is going to say yes, angry enough to, for a third time, say that he wants to die. At which point God is going to make the point in verse 10. "You pity the plant for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in a night and perished in a night. And should I not pity Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle?" And that's it. We don't hear about what happened to Jonah, but the thing that might have most caught my attention was the way in which he directs Jonah's attention to the fact that God is invested, even in the cattle, so much so that he cares that even though we use them for food, he still cares about the needless suffering of the cattle, the creatures in Nineveh, the needless suffering of the people of Nineveh, no matter how foul they had become, and likewise, the understanding and the needless suffering of his prophet, even though he brought him through a process that added to his suffering, even when he was already in anguish and distress. But the point was to bring him to a greater understanding of how much God cared for even the least among us. Or this time, not so much the least in terms of the poorest, but the least in terms of character. understanding that his kindness is greater than our shame for the things that we have done. But his kindness is for everyone. And so he is not offering the Ninevites a blank check any more than he is offering his people, Israel and Judah, a blank check. And so, as it notes back in chapter 3, part of what the Ninevites did was to not only call out to God in chapter 3, verse 8, but to turn from the dirt that they were doing, because the things that we do have both foreseen and unforeseen consequences. And even when we mean well, sometimes the things that we are doing are harming people in ways we don't realize. And so what God is doing in giving them the opportunity to make a turn is hopefully giving them the opportunity to avoid the pitfalls that come with making a turn. Understanding that the metaphor for making a turn is sometimes at its best when we look at it as a 180-degree turn away from the things that we do that harm others, either intentionally or unintentionally. But the tragedy of the Ninevite story is that they eventually make a 360-degree turn back into the characteristics that put them on a path toward needless suffering, as the prophet Nahum is eventually going to help us see. Nineveh is actually going to be destroyed down the road after God finishes using them to discipline his people who won't listen in the short term. Danger is for Nineveh, as we mentioned, that even though they will listen in the short term, long term, they're going to end up in just about the same position as Israel and Judah. Getting off the road to needless drama long enough to get a favor from God. But as we saw that Jelly Roll noticed a while back, who are we to expect a savior if we only come to God when we need a favor? And so if we are actually going to get off of the road to needless drama and suffering and stay off of the road to needless drama and suffering, at some point, we're going to have to stop only coming to God, genuinely coming to God when we need a favor.